Hi, good evening, and welcome to CNP Phase 3 Open House 2. I see we've got 3 attendees who joined us so far, so I'm just going to wait 1 minute before starting. Okay, the attendees have really filled up here, so let's get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Central Neighbourhood Plan Open House 2. This is for Phase 3 of the Central Neighbourhood Plan. My name is Barry Warren. I am project coordinator with Acoustics, the lead town planner for the Central Neighbourhood Plan. Joining me tonight as panelists are Paul Fensky, who is the principal with Acoustics and the lead urban designer for the project, as well as Barclay Pickethley, Mission's Deputy Chief Administrative Officer, as well as a project manager for the Central Neighbourhood Plan for Mission. So welcome. The purpose of Open House 2 is for us to share the work we've been doing on the Central Neighbourhood Plan to date, including what we've done over the last 6 months for Phase 3, the Draft Preferred Plan. It's also an opportunity for people to ask questions of us, as well as ask questions of the consulting team and provide feedback on the work we've completed to date. So just a bit of housekeeping to get started. This is the format for the presentation this evening. We're going to be doing a presentation with this PDF slideshow, walking through 3 sections, background on the Central Neighbourhood Plan and the work done in Phase 1 and Phase 2, the current work we've done for Phase 3, which is the Draft Preferred Plan, as well as planning and implementation. There's also going to be a presentation of a 3D model video to help understand the plan on the topography. And then we'll also be doing a live question and answer at the end of the session. We've got until 8:30, so the presentation will probably take about an hour, maybe a little bit longer, and then we'll do Q&A after that, going up until our hard stop at 8:30. After tonight, the open house will be ongoing at engage.mission.ca/CNP. There'll be a Q&A period going from tonight until February 9th. At which point people can direct questions to the consulting team, and we'll be able to direct questions specifically to different experts that work on different scopes of the project. There will also be a survey that's available. It's going to be launched, I think, tomorrow morning, and it'll be available until February 23rd. All the feedback provided in the survey will be provided to council to assist in their decision-making for the neighborhood plan. So section 1, background on the Central Neighbourhood Plan. So the Central Neighbourhood Plan fits into part of Mission's planning framework for Silverdale. Mission's official community plan designated the Silverdale Comprehensive Planning Area as an area for future urban growth in Mission. Of course, in order to get from this vision in the OCP to the neighborhood planning process and future development, a project was needed, or a document was needed to fill the gap for servicing, to clearly define how servicing would be brought in from Mission proper to the Silverdale Comprehensive Planning Area, which is this 3,400-acre area, mostly rural lands with independent servicing, so private well systems and septic fields, not currently having the urban servicing of drinking water provision and sanitary systems that are needed in order to permit development at urban densities. So the master infrastructure strategy was completed and adopted in 2020. And what the master infrastructure strategy did is provide this, both the planning framework as well as the specific infrastructure concepts to bring in the water, sanitary, and stormwater systems needed in order to permit urban development in Silverdale. It also provided for areas that should be protected either as conservation areas or forest parks and forest trails as recreation areas that can be valued by residents as well as people in Mission proper. It planned for approximately 17,000 homes and a population of 40,000 to grow in Silverdale over about the next 80 years. It also included recommendations for municipal cost recovery strategies, so those mechanisms that would ensure that development is paid for by itself and does not become a burden for taxpayers. And it included recommendations on the neighborhood plan areas and how to implement neighborhood planning. So there's 3 areas in the Silverdale Comprehensive Planning Area, or neighborhood planning areas. The West neighborhood, generally located between Silvermere Lake, and then when the steep slopes of the Central neighborhood start near Manza Street. The Central neighborhood, generally bound by Silverdale, the West neighborhood, Chester Creek over to the east, and then more rural and agricultural lands up to the north. And then the east neighborhood, generally between that Chester Creek and Silverdale Creek boundary. The Central Neighborhood Plan is the focus of our current work. Part of the master infrastructure strategy, or an outcome of the master infrastructure strategy, was development of a council policy document, Land 64C, which outlined how neighborhood planning could proceed in Silverdale. It's the terms of reference that all of our work is going through currently as part of the CNP process. So it outlines the specific technical studies, required communication, and the phases for the project. This is missions planning process. So our work is beholden to Land 64C, and it's going to be mission and council that approve all components of the Central Neighborhood Plan, from city staff approving the work we did back in phase 1 to council approving the work in phase 2 and phase 3, and eventually council approving the final neighborhood plan document. Land 64C outlined 2 ways that neighborhood planning could be initiated within the Silverdale Comprehensive Planning Area, either by the city or by a proponent, but only if the proponent has support of over 60% of the land area in the planning area. So that's our work now, is we are undertaking a proponent-led neighborhood plan, the proponent being Polygon, who, as you'll see on this map, control 70% of the land area within the Central Neighborhood Plan, as shown in that light blue color. But even though this is a proponent-led neighborhood plan, this is all following the city's planning process. So this is a public planning process. It's not intended to be biased towards just the proponent. We're trying to make this, or a fundamental principle of the planning process is to make it as equitable as possible and feasible for residents in Silverdale. The purpose of the neighborhood plan is to advance the City of Mission's vision for Silverdale as outlined in the OCP. The CNP is the first of the neighborhood plans to be initiated. So we expect that sometime in the future, East and West neighborhood plans will also be undertaken, either through a city-led process or potentially initiated by a proponent. All the work we're doing is in accordance with the city's Land 64C policy. It includes guided or council-approved guided planning principles, authorized public engagement, as we're doing this evening, and detailed technical studies, which are all being reviewed by the city staff as well as their expert consultant, Urban Systems. Consultation is following the council-approved public engagement and communication strategy, and we are required to consult with the public using the International Association of Public Participation spectrum of consultation, which means we'll be providing fair and balanced information, objective information to the public as well as CNP landowners, and there'll be an opportunity for the public to provide feedback on the work that we've presented. This whole process targets completion of an adopted neighborhood plan for spring of this year. What I'm presenting on the screen here is the public process timeline. So in accordance with Land 64C, it's a 4-phase process. Began with phase 1, technical due diligence and biophysical studies. Phase 2 initiated in November. It was a preliminary design options, where we looked at different design alternatives for a preliminary neighborhood plan. We received direction from council on the draft preferred plan in August of last year, and that really kicked off the preferred plan technical studies where we are today, highlighted in orange on this timeline. So as you can see by the "We Are Here" flag, we're in open house number 2, February 2nd, presenting the draft preferred plan. Last time we had an opportunity to do this was back in June for open house 1. Upcoming key milestone dates for the project are a targeted council workshop on February 16th, where we'll be presenting plans and technical studies to council as well as staff, working through comments and questions. We'll also be bringing an interim summary of feedback that's gathered from tonight's presentation via the Engage Mission survey to that council workshop. So the council has an opportunity to see public comment. Following that, we are targeting going to council on March 7th to get a resolution on the draft preferred plan to end phase 3. And for that council session, we'll be bringing the full feedback summary. So any questions or any surveys that we receive Between February 16th and February 23rd, the closing of our survey period, a summary of that will be brought to council in advance of the March 7th presentation. Of course, the CNP is not just being prepared by Akistics. We've got a whole expert consulting team. It includes Intercad, our civil engineer, PGL, the environmental consultant, expert transportation planners, Bunch & Associates, Aerostone Archaeology, doing archaeological overview assessments and providing guidance related to archaeological issues, Geo-Pacific, who completed the geohazard report for phase 1 studies, and Rowland Associates, land economists who are working through the financial cost recovery mechanisms. The process is receiving oversight from the city's consultant, Urban Systems, expert consultants in land planning and engineering, as well as city staff. We're undergoing a multi-departmental input and review led by Barclay, as well as the City of Mission's engineering planning lead. And with that, I pass it over to you, Paul Fensky, to start speaking through the sustainable planning principles that are guiding our CNP process.
That's great. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Barry. I think as Barry mentioned, the work of the CNP is really building on the findings and undertakings of the Master Infrastructure Strategy passed in June 2020, as well as those terms of reference to guide good civic-minded planning and design that are embedded within Council Policy Land 64C. In addition, and woven throughout that council policy, is a desire to do things different. And so as we look at Silverdale SCPA area, and we look specifically at the Central Neighborhood Plan, we're not trying to replicate Mission. We're instead trying to move Mission towards a more sustaining and complete future form. And that really means having a different relationship with the land and our arrangement of uses. And that means ecologically working with nature, socially supporting the local community, and economically ensuring that that neighborhood is viable, both in the short term as well as in the long-term addition to Mission. Next slide. Next slide. So as the CMP, following Land 64 terms of reference, seeks to have a more sustainable community form and mixture of uses. In terms of working with the land, that means ensuring that we conserve ecological integrity within the CMP, and that we also then create an integrated network of parks and natural spaces, both active and passive, both in order to recreate as well as celebrate our natural heritage. Next slide. Socially, the design of the community is around trying to support and ensuring that we do support local community. And that really means having a vibrant and diverse community that has a wide range of ages, as well as incomes, lifestyles, and life stages, that's represented through a balance of different housing forms, from single family and townhomes all the way through to apartment and condo living. It also means having support for a feasible and economically sound community, in which there are not just bedroom communities, but more complete communities with schools and places of work, places of shop and worship, all within one. It also means that we are able to celebrate local art and culture within the neighborhood. Next slide. Economically, moving towards sustainability means planning viable neighborhoods. And it starts with working with the land to design compact, walkable neighborhoods that fit with the land and the terrain, and ensuring that our street systems are for everyone, that they are multimodal in their approach to transportation, looking at public transit from buses and trains right through to the car and the individual opportunity for walking, biking, and recreating throughout the neighborhood. That also means then that we're looking at new street standards and the opportunity to employ more green infrastructure systems, especially how we manage rainwater within the neighborhood over the long term. And in doing so, the hope is to garner a sense of what Silverdale's character is in terms of a sense of place within the design, celebrating the views and the special qualities that Silverdale presents within the larger community. Next slide. Well, as Barry noted, phase one was a serious review of the technical findings to confirm our starting point for the central neighborhood plan design. So building on the work of the MIS that was undertaken, further higher resolved studies were undertaken, looking at archaeology, geotechnical, as well as environmental resources within the 1,800 acres of the CNP. Those were summarized within the slide on the screen, looking at biophysical findings in terms of 4 levels of constraint. The darkest areas being the steepest slopes and the most environmentally sensitive areas being the most constrained and therefore the darkest. Then moving into moderately constrained, lowly constrained, and the lightest color being the unconstrained. All of that, of course, was combined with riparian areas, wetlands, where existing roads are, property boundaries, as well as in orange, those areas of high and moderate archaeological potential. This finding and the series of studies that went into it are of a high standard and have been reviewed by staff and urban systems to confirm a solid foundation for neighborhood planning at a detailed level. Next slide. Fundamental to that phase one was building on the green network established in the MIS as a structure in which to ensure ecological integrity through structuring conservation planning within the framework of the neighborhood itself. The natural open space ESA community park, which forms the structure for the neighborhood framework, is composed of steep slopes, those defined as 30% or greater, riparian corridors and setbacks, community-wide destination parks, as well as those lands required for visual impact buffers. In total, those lands separate out approximately 40% of the total CNP area for conservation and landscape retention. Of course, in addition to these lands will be active green spaces within schools, neighborhood parks, and community centers. Next slide. Building on the findings of phase one and the proposed neighborhood framework to conserve ecological resources within the CNP, we undertook with the team a series of explorations, how to begin to tie together the hillside, those gentle lands that are more conducive for civic centers as identified within the MIS, as well as the new information that came to light through our phase one studies. And that resulted in presenting the CNP Foundation Plan back at open house number 1. And the foundation plan on the left was to realize what a viable community that would achieve sustainability targets in the MIS would look like. And so we see the variety of different colors, all relating to different land uses required to have a complete and robust, complete community in Silverdale. That plan was largely driven by the land itself, given the significant topographic challenges, moving from Silverdale on the bottom all the way up to the summit at the north end of the plan. And in doing so, trying to use as much of the existing road network in terms of Silverdale, Loftus, Gunn, and Olson as possible in threading together these opportunities presented within the CNP. In addition to the foundation plan, really driven by the topography, we also explored opportunities we called options, which really focused on opportunities within the foundation plan to further increase or densify the neighborhood with more urban lots, as well as look at alternate configurations for community facilities, alternate alignments for major street networks that still work with the land and environmental resources, and serve to maximize the extent of the required municipal infrastructure. Next slide. All of that work and the technical studies produced and prepared by the team were then presented to council in the summer, along with the feedback, both public and landowner, from the first round of engagement through open house number 1. Council had a chance to deliberate and review the information and gave direction to the consulting team and city staff on the tenets of a draft preferred plan, really emphasizing 6 areas that they wanted to see and have technically tested. Starting with number 1, an opportunity to jumpstart the community with increased density as a way of further financing the required trunk servicing for the not only the CNP area, but the larger Silverdale Comprehensive Planning area. And so there were opportunities of further densification identified in those areas number 1 within the lower slopes. Those areas to receive the trunk infrastructure first. As well, there was an opportunity to begin to consolidate a series of community uses around number 2, the intersection of Gunn and the new arterial road that climbs up onto the Jameson Bench. And in doing so, establish a new civic core, repositioned more centrally to better service the needs of the community, especially the lower slopes, with a combination of community, elementary school, neighborhood parks, as well as a new proposed community center. In number 3, there was also a desire from council to enable a new collector street that would link across the lower slopes, above Silverdale, but below Gunn Avenue. And in doing so, better utilize development lands and smaller property owners with a collecting street and ground-oriented densification, either through single family or in opportunities for townhouse, all in support of that new civic center. Council also finalized the most strategic location for the new fire hall in number 4, at the confluence of the major arterial and the collector roads that serve both the middle and upper slopes. They also reviewed and gave direction on the need to balance environmental sensitivity with the requirements of the major street network in number 5. And finally, reviewed the different options for the repositioning of the upper slopes urban village elements, school, mixed use, community center, and in doing so, further establish a stronger and more direct southern gateway from the 4-lane arterial on the bench up to the summit itself. All of those directions, 1 through 6, were received by the consulting team and have then been reviewed in detail through phase 3, the technical feasibility review. Next slide. Part 2, where we begin to now look at that technical feasibility review. We took the directions from council and continue to refine the original designs, working with the land, working with the environmental systems, as well as the city's new livable street standards. And did a series of 8 technical reviews to test the plan and refine it to ensure that the plan was able to deliver on the promises made. That was done through street engineering design with InterCAD, Bunce transportation impact assessment, looking at modeling and traffic loading to ensure streets run smoothly. We also looked at civic facilities from schools and community centers, destination parks, and everything in between to make sure that they were equitably distributed throughout the neighborhood, as well as throughout the topography, having lower, middle, and upper slope services. That was also looked at more detailed in terms of a master parks and trail plan. InterCAD engineering also was able to confirm the municipal servicing designs for water, sanitary collection, as well as rainwater infiltration management. Rollo Associates, our land economists, were able to look at the financial feasibility of bringing on a development like this through its phases and being able to afford the civic infrastructure and the kind of net benefits that such a neighborhood would bring to larger mission. Environmentally, PGL, Ponderja Garrity, our registered professional biologists, were also able to do a full environmental impact assessment. And as you'll see tonight, we're also able to assess the visual impacts of the neighborhood as it presents both on the land as well as its impact from key views within Mission itself. So let's undertake a more detailed review of these 8 technical studies, testing Council's preferred direction for the land use plan for the CMP. Of course, central to any urban neighborhood are streets. And the street design that was proposed and has now been solidified through the city's new livable street standards are standards that look at not only vehicle movements within public right-of-ways, but also how best to promote alternative modes of transportation, specifically in the form of pedestrians, cyclists, as well as the whole new era of e-bikes and e-scooters. And in doing that in such a way that we begin to minimize our physical impacts on the landscape, and especially our visual and environmental impacts as we build new roads within the community. And that includes ensuring street trees within the public right-of-way, separated dedicated sidewalks and multi-use paths, as well as full cutoff lighting systems that limit light pollution. In doing so, those new road standards then that were tested not only minimize the extent of paved surfaces and improve bike safety and pedestrian use of streets, but also limit light pollution and improve the permeability, especially of rainwater, back into the ground systems. The application of the livable street standards within the CMP through the street design engineering review means then that the major street network, as well as the local streets presented on the plan, all meet these new standards. And in doing so, is able to move the neighborhood towards a much more multimodal transportation system. Next slide. In addition to looking at the engineering of the major street systems and the local streets, applying the new city livable street standards, we also looked at the generation of traffic over time, ultimately for the full build out of the projected homes and uses within the CMP. That work was done by Bunt and Associates, a highly regarded transportation engineers within Vancouver. And they did that in the form of the transportation impact assessment, where they took not only the street network and the uses, but the ultimate build out and did a full live traffic modeling to ensure that the roads were sufficiently designated to handle traffic, that intersections would have lights or stops in order to minimize morning and afternoon congestions, and to ensure that connections both within the community as well as to the highway would be according to standards acceptable to both Mission residents as well as to the Provincial Ministry of Transportation and Highways. The outcome of that has been a confirmation of the proposed street network and hierarchy. It has also then led between Council's direction and the current plan with the redesignation of Silverdale Avenue from collector status to recognizing that it will in fact take more traffic and need to be redesignated as a 2-lane arterial. In addition, the transportation impact assessment in consultation with urban systems and the city engineering department, we're also looking at potential realignments of Gallardi arterial in order to better connect Gallardi directly into Silverdale. Of course, this work is ongoing and will be presented to Council in the coming weeks. Next slide. In terms of parks and trail, the proposed plan also had a chance to test and ensure that the parks were adequate in the amount of park by type, as well as the park distribution within the neighborhood as a total. And as you can see, the natural area park or forest legacy park includes not only steep slopes, but also sensitive habitat, as well as generous areas of existing forest, prime with opportunities for passive recreation, creating a long-term legacy for Silverdale. In addition, in the darkest green, we have destination community parks, both at the summit as well as at the mid-slopes, serving as major stopping points and gathering areas for community celebration and enjoyment. At a scale more closer to the individual home, you can see in apple green the distribution of neighborhood parks. Those parks that are more geared for local immediate neighborhood use, all to be within a 5-minute walk of every home. You can see that their scale ranges between 1.5 and 3 acres in size, and that they're fairly equally distributed around the neighborhood in order to have that accessibility to individuals, including children. The outcome then of our review is not only propose the system of multi-use pathways and sidewalks within the new street network, but also to complement that with approximately 20 acres of new dedicated forest trails that will serve to link across the ravine areas, link together the various precincts or enclaves within the neighborhood, as well as link to the larger civic centers, both in the lower, the mid, and the upper slopes. Next slide. InterCAD civil engineers, in combination with the city's own engineering department and with oversight and input from urban systems, we're also able to look at the drinking water supply, the sanitary treatment design, as well as the stormwater management design proposed within the draft preferred plan. In terms of drinking water, city water will be supplied to Silverdale and the larger SCPA through trunk servicing, as identified in the larger blue dot in the lower portion of the left screen. That extension of trunk servicing will allow water to be accessed for every home within the CMP through a series of 2 reservoirs across 7 pressure zones. This design also includes protection of existing private wells on private properties. In terms of sanitary, the extension of GAP services through to the central neighborhood plan will mean that through a collection of both gravity drains as well as force main flows, all future sewage will be collected with treatment at the James Treatment Plant in Abbotsford. In terms of managing future rainwater events, especially in the age of climate change and climate change awareness, the CNP proposes a layered approach, ensuring that post-development flows in the future match existing conditions on the ground today, both to protect existing wells, but also to protect existing streams and habitat, and to avoid major flooding in the future. The system proposes a layered approach that looks at active detention and infiltration as close to source as possible, both on individual sites as well as within street right-of-ways. That's layered within more conventional neighborhood ponds, filtering water, detaining it, slowing it in order to feed into existing creek systems, ensuring habitat values and oxygen levels, especially in the summer, as well as an emergency bypass system termed a diversion bypass to take large storm events directly into the Fraser if and when necessary. Next slide. The draft preferred plan has also had a chance to do a full financial and cost recovery analysis. That work was done by Rollin Associates, and it was done to ensure that the mechanisms going forward would ensure that community growth is paid for by development and not by current mission taxpayers. Rollin Associates were able to complete a full detailed financial model, looking at the cost of infrastructure according to phasing, who would pay for it, and how those funds would go towards building not only the needed infrastructure, but also providing the required community facilities. The outcome then is a clear direction for council and staff to move on in terms of how to provide expanded municipal infrastructure and services, as well as acknowledging within the CMP its addition and contribution for new job creation in both construction, as well as service and professional positions with the build out of the neighborhood. And in doing so, the overall enhancement of the mission residential and commercial tax base. Next slide. As mentioned at the beginning with the conservation framework, our work with Pottinger Garrity has led to a full environmental impact assessment, where PGL was able to confirm the conservation framework, identify potential impacts to that framework, and propose both protection as well as mitigation measures. The outcome of that is that this current CMP draft neighborhood plan protects more than 80% of the most sensitive ecosystems within the CMP, along with protecting more than 75% of the identified wildlife corridors. This high-level environmental mitigation and monitoring recommendations have also been woven in to the EIA in order to make sure that the CMP moves forward in a way that works best with the land and its environmental resources. Next slide. In addition to the EIA, we've also been able to undertake a visual impact assessment, looking at the land in its current state using 1 meter LiDAR contour information, as well as the current state and height of the CMP's forest system. And looking at, with the development of the CMP over time in the areas that have been designated for use, how impactful will that be from major places within the community? The screen in front of us looks specifically at 4 areas. In the upper left, looking from the view from the bridge deck of Mission Bridge on the arrival north into Mission. And as we can see, the forest line is largely intact. We've gone so far in these screenshots to add buildings representing typical land uses. And we can see a slight blue area in the center of the screen representing the presence of 3-story buildings represented within mixed use and townhomes and single family uses. On the upper right, we have a view from the causeway, the western gateway into both Mission, but also into Silverdale more specifically. And we see that even with the addition of an 8-story apartment building on the grand outlook, that building is the only thing that punctuates the existing tree line. Likewise, in the lower left, a view from Cherry Avenue, we see again the intact nature of the tree lines and the ridge lines and the strategic positioning of the existing conservation framework as proposed in order to break up development and really mask the presence of the CMP within key viewpoints within Mission. And finally, a view in the lower right from Mission Sports Field and Sports Park, we can see again only the odd apartment building and its very specific location within the mid slopes would at this point punctuate the skyline. And in doing so, the visual impact assessment has confirmed the opportunity to preserve the natural hillside character, as well as provide visual relief and natural continuity, even within an urban form in the future as Silverdale develops out. Next slide. I think at this point, there's an opportunity for us to pause and understand that visual impact assessment in a 3-dimensional form. And we also will then move from the slideshow to the 3D model that we use to grab those screenshots. And again, this is using the latest LiDAR or 1 meter ground survey, bringing as much detail to the landform as possible, and then overlaying it with the LiDAR information on existing forest canopy to be retained within the conservation zone to look at the impact even at that stage, again from these critical arrival points. And as we can see, when we get down to the Southgate Bridge deck, the ridge lines are left intact. Portions of the neighborhood are visible, but those portions are relatively small and provide opportunities for key views while still maintaining the forested character of Silverdale in its current state. As we fly along to the west, following the alignment of Highway 7, we see the very distinct terraces of land provided within the CMP. But as we get down to the elevation of Nelson Street and the highway, we see that the foreground trees, as well as the midground and upper slope protected areas, do an excellent job at screening and breaking up the future visual impact of the neighborhood. As we move west along Highway 7, we see opportunities in purple and blue, the community center and the elementary school, for spectacular views south over the Fraser River, as well as smaller pockets of both neighborhood park in the green, as well as single family and townhome in the yellow and orange, but again, broken up into smaller views, ensuring that the larger fabric of the forest and the forest experience is maintained, even within the urban design. As we move towards the west further, we see clear views of Mount Baker, as well as from the west neighborhood, specifically Donatellian Highway. We see even the mid slopes and summit are hidden from view. As we move towards the western gateway, we wanted to confirm that the land use designs would be set within the forest. And apart from the strategically placed apartment sites on those high terraces, all the buildings, being generally 3 to 4 stories, would be less in height than the current tree canopy that's retained within the conservation framework. Views from the north, looking back onto Silverdale, would remain forested in a rural state. The rural opportunity presented off Barrett is shown on the screen as the upper summit neighborhood is revealed, with the centerpiece being the retained forest crown, the highest point of land within the CNP. Moving to the east, looking from Clay, the existing forested slopes largely screen the summit neighborhood. And as we move all the way to the east to District Hall, we see even from an elevation, the ridge lines intact with forest. As we begin to drop down to street level, we see again the retention of that forested edge. Flying to the west to a more central position within Mission at Cherry, near the school, we also wanted to understand the function of those protected eastern slopes. And again, how they provide strategic positioning in screening the future neighborhood, as well as retaining the existing forested ridgeline. And finally, a view from Mission Sports Park. We see distinct terraces of both single family and townhome, but we also see the forested nature and the smaller openings that the design permits. And finally, the model offers the opportunity to have to take in some of the panoramic views afforded from within the neighborhood, looking out both south towards Mount Baker and over the Fraser River and the agricultural lands of Abbotsford, as well as the sense of light and panorama as it pans towards the west, looking down the Fraser River towards Vancouver itself. And of course, north, looking back on the Stave Lake and the municipal forest lands. You can also see where the prominent positions, like in purple, the future proposed community center, and blue, the elementary school sites, are given prominent locations in order to have panoramic views from those public destinations and facilities. Having gone through that technical review, the plan has further been refined and fitted into the land and tested according to the support needed by major street systems, as well as how individual properties can be accessed with local streets in order to bring to fruition a future urban neighborhood. Of course, this neighborhood is not designed to replicate Mission as of today, but instead is looking towards a much different form, one that's really focused around walkable, compact civic cores. And on the screen here, we see that building on the work of the MIS, the refinement of the draft preferred plan has been able to achieve and add to that idea of primary, secondary, and tertiary civic cores. Specifically with the addition of a new central lower slopes core near the intersection of Gunn and the 4-lane arterial that climbs up the hill. The addition of that then means that the vast majority of future uses within the CMP are within a 5 or 10-minute walk of central community services and destination facilities. Next slide. In addition, the plan then has been able to finalize its proposal for the location of community facilities. And in doing so, ensured that there was elementary schools at the lower, middle, as well as upper portions of the neighborhood. New to the preferred plan is the addition of a new community center in the lower slopes as part of the civic precinct proposed for the new walking or the new civic core in the lower slopes, paired with commercial as well as joint elementary school and park. In addition, the 2-acre centrally located fire hall has been established, again supporting council direction for its position from the summer, as well as the amount of commercial and mixed use, both retail as well as second-story office, has been increased to better future-proof the plan and add more employment and opportunities within the CMP itself. And finally, in addition to parks and schools and community centers, public works have also had a chance to be reviewed, with additional public works lands added across the neighborhood at both the lower, middle, and upper sites in the lightest purple. Next slide. Using that model of the civic walking cores on the gentlest areas of land supported by the major street systems, with then the destination parks and community facilities of schools and community centers, fire halls and mixed-use retail and commercial. We then added to and refined the position of the apartments to be supported by those civic cores, as well as to take advantage of some of the upper view opportunities, but later on in the neighborhood. Later on, once the market is matured and there's a demand for such living arrangements, as well as a demand for the services. Next slide. Complementing, but at a ground-oriented form, are townhomes. And as you can see on the slide, the density continues to be assumed approximately 20 units per acre. And while it has 15% of the total land base in orange, it holds more than half of the proposed units going forward. And again, those have been positioned to better support community facilities, commercial, as well as major street systems for transit access, as well as being responsive to the hillsides, especially properties that don't have access to public streets or public street access that is feasible based on the cost of having to cross environmentally sensitive areas. And finally, next slide, the residential single family. The residential single family proposed within the CMP is that of an urban density, averaged out at 5 units per acre, generally 600 to 700 meter lots. Of course, this is an average. There'll be some areas of compact housing that might be a little bit higher, but given the hillside nature of the CMP overall, there'll also be many areas that are designated single family, either rural estate or urban, that won't achieve that 5 unit per acre average. Again, they've been distributed to ensure that there's a mix of housing types, large homes, medium homes, duplexes, as a transition then ultimately into townhomes and apartment forms within the civic cores. And unlike the townhomes, the single family form has access and reliance on public streets for public road frontage and fee simple development, as well as bare land strata streets, if and as the case may be. So both the street position as well as the land use designation have been refined through engineering in order to best fit the land while maintaining the overall integrity of the environmental systems, the grading of the major street positions, and the viability of the 4 proposed civic cores, lower, middle, and upper within the CMP. Next slide. Next slide. Of course, in working with the land without contours, it is somewhat easy to forget how challenging the land is. So the CMP, and specifically the draft, where we've tested and refined and better fit the ideas and designations and road design to the land itself, has really been a test around engaging the constraints. For the CMP does present a very challenging environment for neighborhood development, given the complex topography, slopes, environmental systems. But in addition to the constraints, the CMP also looks at those larger, more congruent areas of gentle lands as most conducive for those growth cores or those civic centers, while still providing direct access both into Mission as well as into Highway 7. Next slide. The resulting diversity of homes and densities meets and even exceeds those targets presented in the MIS. So in responding to Mission's anticipated housing needs, there is a full range of housing forms in order to address issues of affordability, income range, as well as lifestyle and life stage, specifically looking at opportunities to downsize and age in place while remaining within the community. The housing assessment confirms the distribution of the various land use densities in response to the environment features as well as the topography and major streets. And as is presented in the circle graph in the lower right. Overall, the CMP anticipates an opportunity for 10,150 homes, divided according to single family, townhome, apartment, as well as mixed use. Next slide. Looking at by the numbers in relation to the targets set in 2020 through the Master Infrastructure Strategy, or MIS, we see that the MIS estimated approximately 9,400 units within the central neighborhood. The Draft Preferred Plan has been able to look at a realistic 10,150 units. In terms of the mix of housing types, we can see that through council direction, there's been an increase of urban single family, a significant decrease of lands designated estate or rural single family. Very similar targets in terms of townhouse in orange, a fewer amount of apartments, but a greater number of mixed use or apartment condo forms on top of retail, commercial, and offices, really within the civic cores themselves. In terms of population, there's been a slight increase, approximately 1,700 to 1,800 people over the full build out of the neighborhood to a total of 23,750. Civic facilities, community centers have been expanded from 2 sites to 3 sites, now occupying over 9 hectares. That means that there's more civic sites that will be supported by more people. In terms of retail demand, the plan has also been improved and future-proofed the provision of more commercial mixed-use sites, moving from the suggested 150,000 square feet of commercial and professional services to an opportunity to expand that 3 times to 465,000 through the build out of those civic cores as needed, moving from 3 hectares to almost 6 hectares of land designated for those future uses. Schools, both elementary, middle school, and high school, and student generation rates have also been reviewed with the provision of 3 elementary schools, lower, middle, and upper slopes distributed within the CMP, with an overall increase in terms of the amount of active park commensurate to the increase in population, with a total of 53 hectares of active parks and enjoyment. Bus frequency and transit viability has been maintained and has been improved, especially around the viability of high frequency buses at peak times to ensure the use of alternative transportation as a means of commuting and coming to going from work and home. Next slide. That gets us to the final portion of the presentation, where we look at some of the implementation of some of the initial next steps and considerations when we present this with council. In terms of a land ownership analysis, as mentioned at the beginning, this has been directed by council through the required terms of reference as outlined in Council Policy Land 64C, and according to the council-directed engagement strategy. But of course, the proponent has been leading this in terms of funding the process. The proponent, once again, controls 70% of the CMP lands, and that was really the motivator for initiating what is a very extensive and detailed and costly public planning exercise on behalf of the City of Mission. So in terms of managing change, the neighborhood plan will be a comprehensive framework that provides for the phased development of a more sustainable mixed-use community, and one that does the hard work and heavy lifting of reconciling the land uses with the environment, the topography, ensuring that density and civic facilities are in line with the proposed major street network and public infrastructure to guide future rezoning and subdivision. As a long-term growth plan, the CMP will build out incrementally in the coming decades, and like all good plans, the plan itself will remain adaptable in order to change according to new information as well as changing community needs. Throughout it all, central to the neighborhood plan is the idea of maintaining individual landowner choice. And so while we're looking at the full build out and eventual position of the neighborhood, we also recognize that this will take time and it'll be done within incremental, distinct phases. So landowners will continue to have the choice to develop their properties moving forward according to the neighborhood plan through zoning and development permit and building permit, etc., or not to develop their lands. Instead, to retain them currently as they are. No landowner will be forced to sell or develop their properties. The neighborhood plan is an opportunity to think differently in the future without a requirement to start that change now. Next slide. Next slide. In addition to the neighborhood plan as a guiding document, we also wanted to present information in terms of land equity, who gets what within the way that the land has been draped on the land, working with the topography, the major streets, the environmental resources, as well as this desire to have civic walkable centers at lower, middle, and upper terraces of the neighborhood. And so well recognize the constraints of the land, the equity for all landowners, proponent and non-proponent, has been a cornerstone of our full process. The draft plan tries to distribute density equally and in a fair manner in order to establish those walkable civic cores. So beyond the apartment and the mixed use designations, which are so much part of establishing those 4 civic cores, the proponent and non-proponent lands have very similar proportions of ground-oriented residential, both in terms of the yellow, the single family, as well as the orange townhomes throughout the entire neighborhood. And those, of course, are the land use colors and land uses that are most in demand in the market as the neighborhood builds out. In the lower right, we see again the general proportion of land ownership within the 1,812 acres that is the Central Neighborhood Plan. The proponent controls 70% of that. The city has an additional 3% of existing right-of-ways, most notably within Silverdale, Loftus, Gunn, Olson, Law, Gallardi. And that leaves the non-proponent landowners a total of 106 parcels representing approximately 27%. When we look at the proponent lands of 512 and the non-proponent lands of 197 hectares, and we look at how various land uses have been attributed and distributed across those land ownerships, we see that in terms of the single family and townhouse or the ground-oriented residential, there's a fairly equal distribution. Of course, given the complexity of the lands, no lands are the same, and certainly all the lands are not equal in their ability to provide for future neighborhood needs. And that's been so much of the work over the last year and a half. However, when we look at the distribution, we're very pleased with the equitable movement of ground-oriented units, both single family and townhomes, both within proponent lands, but also within non-proponent lands. One can also see that while the non-proponent lands are providing a little bit of community park and 10 neighborhood parks, it's really the lands of the proponent, as it turns out, to be most conducive for all of those other public facilities, from 3 neighborhood parks to 20 neighborhood parks, 3 school sites, 3 community sites, as well as 4 of the 5 public works sites, all located within those proponent lands, to ensure that the neighborhood is more than simply piecemeal residential development. Next slide. So in finding a home for the civic facilities, we've looked at where those fit best. And again, looking at those areas of larger, more congruent, gentle lands in order to place those land consumptive programs of schools and community parks and recreation centers. And we can see by the numbers that all of those big uses fit on the proponent lands, often because they're associated with the designated civic cores as identified within the MIS and refined within the draft preferred plan. By the numbers then, we see that the proponent lands have upwards of 64, 2/3 of the civic facilities and infrastructure on them, resulting in about 1/3 of their lands available for development. In contrast, the non-proponent landowners have a much more 50-50 split between civic facilities and infrastructure, largely generated by the conservation framework of non-developable and environmentally sensitive lands, with approximately 49% available for development, both rural, single-family, townhomes, as well as some lands even with mixed use. In terms of paying for infrastructure, the proponent, in this case, a very experienced community builder, also recognizes the need to bring in trunk services as early as possible. For without servicing, the Central Neighborhood Plan and the larger SCPA remains but a paper exercise, something that it's really been for the last 40 years. So the proponent recognizes that that will take significant resources, as well as front-ending the need to build it first and get paid back over time later. And so that front-ending of paying for those trunk services includes the roughly $200 million in order to extend the trunk servicing into the lower slopes and ultimately to serve not only the CNP, but the larger SCPA area. The neighborhood plan as a document of council will also bring benefit to Silverdale in the form of driving appreciation of land values, but also driving investment, not only for the central neighborhood plan, but for all of Silverdale, as the community moves towards realizing the vision outlined in the OCP. Next slide. The final slides look at the sequencing of trunk servicing. And unlike the MIS, which looked at a much smaller area, we've been able to look at more broadly at the servicing areas. And it is clear both from the topography as well as where trunk line servicing are coming from the east, that it'll be the lower slopes that will receive trunk servicing and opportunity for urban development first. Sequencing of the mid and upper slopes will depend on future market demand, as well as the servicing efficiencies of the system once they're built. The CNP at the end of the day is an opportunity to bring a comprehensively planned neighborhood totaling 1,800 acres into the local marketplace. And in doing so, increase the supply of homes as well as the range of homes offered, all in the helps of aiding of housing affordability. And as the community builds out and the population increases, there will eventually be demand for those civic cores, the high density areas as well as the mixed use areas. In the meantime, the community is assured to have the infrastructure as well as the proposed parks and natural areas, along with single family and townhome, those highest and best uses of the neighborhood as it initially builds out. And our final slide is an opportunity that the city and the proponent has looked at and currently discussing. And that's the idea of a way of further kickstarting community growth, given the very substantial financial investments needed. The city and the proponents looked at, is there a way of, while we bring those trunk services to Silverdale, also a way of starting to get the community going? This interim servicing strategy would involve bringing water and sanitary services from Nelson Street, as well as installing stormwater pipes and outfalls. And now those pipes would be brought across the Chester Ravine through a pedestrian bridge. And the bridge itself, in addition to the services that it brings, would further link and begin to establish the central neighborhood plan as a new part of mission. If approved, both by the city as well as by senior levels of government, specifically FLNRO, the interim servicing strategy would be able to advance neighborhood development by many years. And with that, I'll close my portion of presenting the draft preferred neighborhood plan and pass it back to Barry.
Thanks, Paul. As we wrap the draft neighborhood plan presentation and transition into the Q&A portion of this evening's webinar, I just want to circle back to the CNP schedule so we can look at what the next steps are following the open house. So again, we're at open house 2, consists of 2 webinars that we've conducted this evening, as well as an in-person presentation tomorrow evening at the Clark Theatre. Following this, the next key milestone date is going to be council workshop that we're targeting for February 16th, where we'll bring the draft technical studies as well as neighborhood plans and documents. I have that reviewed with council and staff to guide their future decision-making on the process. At that council workshop, we'll be bringing a summary of the feedback that we'll have received to date from our Open House 2 feedback survey, which will be posted on engagemission.ca/CNP tomorrow, so that they can have an understanding of the public's feedback and comment up to that point. The survey will stay up for another week following that until February 23rd. Once the survey closes, we'll provide a complete final survey summary, send it to council so that they have an opportunity to review it before they're presented with the CNP draft preferred, or the CNP preferred plan for targeting for approval on the council date of March 7th. So please, after this evening, or tomorrow, once the survey is launched, go to engagemission.ca/CNP to fill out the survey. Once phase 3 is complete, we're expecting about a 3-month process to prepare the CNP policy document which we're targeting for to have an approved neighborhood plan sometime in June.